what I thought I'd do is to work through the exam, tell you what the answers are and where you could find them in the slides. So let's get started. So question number 1, this is about shortages and surpluses and why prices tend to fall and rise. So here we're going to want to look at our equilibrium lecture. And the answer is on this slide here, number 12. All right, the idea here is that when there's a shortage, there are more buyers who want to buy the good at the given price than there are sellers who want to sell. So buyers must compete to see who's going to be one of the limited buyers who actually end up with the good. And the way they compete is they can bid prices up. Similarly, when there's a surplus, we've got more sellers who want to sell at that given price than buyers who want to buy from them. So sellers now have to compete to see who's going to be the lucky one who gets to sell at that given price. And the way they can compete with each other is to bid prices down. So when there's a shortage, buyers have to bid prices up. When there's a surplus, sellers have to bid prices down in order to see who's going to be the first person in line to get a job with a surplus of labor, or the first person to get a pretzel when there's a shortage of pretzels. All right, so that's the answer for that one. For number 2, this is asking about the law of comparative advantage and specifically how you'd explain it to a high school student who hasn't taken any economics classes. And the answer to this one is in our first week of lectures, and you could talk about PPF curves and saying do things at the lowest opportunity cost. That got you, 8 or 9 points out of 10. But the simplest way is to just use one of these really simple examples we talked about that didn't invoke PPF curves or opportunity cost at all. Just talking about, why Martha Stewart hires someone to do her ironing, or why Michael Jordan was ridiculed for playing basketball. So that is what got you the most points. So, Martha Stewart must sacrifice time that she could have spent writing books in order to iron her own shirts. So it benefits her to hire someone else to iron shirts for her, even if that person is worse at ironing than she is. Right. All right, number 3, this is where a lot of people had trouble, and all 5 of these questions came from kind of 2 sections. The first thing was you had to know your determinants of supply here and your determinants of demand here. Okay, so slides 19 and 41 in the week 2 lectures. And then also knowing how to move around supply and demand. So this would be slides 19 and 20, really 18, 19, and 20 together. These 3 slides will tell you how to solve these problems. So for each of these questions, we need to figure out which determinant of supply and demand is changing, and then we can change it on the graph, and that will actually give us the answer to this price and quantity. So for all of these questions, when you're doing questions like this in the future, we should always start off by just drawing a regular old supply and demand graph in equilibrium. All right, we got price, we got quantity, supply, demand. All right, we can draw that before you even look at the question. That's going to be our starting point. All right, and now it's saying that electric cars have been getting less expensive. And how do we expect this to change the price and quantity of gasoline sold? So we're only worried about the price and quantity of gasoline. So this is going to be the market for gasoline. All right, and the thing that's going to make something happen is this first sentence here: electric cars have been getting less expensive. All right, so if we think about our determinants of supply and demand, all right, what's going on here? Well, if we look through them all or remember them, this is one that's going to leap out at us. The price of substitutes. Electric cars are a substitute for gasoline. And so if electric cars are getting cheaper, that's going to make the demand for gasoline less. People are going to buy more electric cars, and as a result, they don't need as much gasoline. A lot of people said that, but much fewer people actually graphed it out. Okay, so demand's going to decrease. So what do? We draw a new demand curve to the left of the old demand curve. All right, and then all we have to do is compare the old equilibrium price and quantity. So this is the old equilibrium price. Here's the old equilibrium quantity to the new equilibrium. There's the new equilibrium price, and there's the new equilibrium quantity. All right, how does the price compare? The price has gone down. How does the quantity compare? The quantity has also gone down. So all you would have to say is the price falls and the quantity falls. All right, that would get you full credit for part A. For part B, it's talking about the number of this says consumer, it should say computer science majors increasing. All right, so again, before we even read too far into the question, let's just draw our supply and demand graph at rest, our starting point. All right, we can graph out equilibrium. There we go. All right, and we're wondering, how is this going to affect the wage and the number of people employed as computer programmers? Don't show this again. There we go. Okay, so this is going to be the market for computer programmers. All right, and now we need to know, okay, the number of computer science majors has risen. Okay, and what's that going to do in the market for computer programmers? So again, if we remember our determinants, the one that should leap out of us here is the entry or exit of producers. We have more producers joining the market. We have more people who know how to code entering the job market. And so what's that going to do? That's going to shift the supply of computer programmers to the right. It's going to increase the supply. So that's the new supply curve. We find the new equilibrium. It's here. Okay, now if we compare, we see that the price is lower and the quantity is higher. All right, so we'd expect the wages of computer programmers to fall, and we'd expect the number employed to rise. All right, and that's how we'd answer part B. All right, moving on. All right, part C again. Before we even read the question, let's draw our supply and demand graph. And get our starting point set up. Okay, so we have a situation where people choose between becoming nurses and becoming occupational therapists. All right, and saying that the wages of nurses have risen dramatically. All right, we want to know how this is going to affect the wage of occupational therapists and the number of occupational therapists. So this is going to be the market for occupational therapists. All right, and so what's the event? What's the shock here? Nurses are making more money. Becoming a nurse has become more lucrative. Okay, so if we think about this one, this is again going to be a determinant of supply, and this time it's going to be a change in opportunity costs. The opportunity cost of being an occupational therapist has gone up, right? Because every year you spend as an occupational therapist is a year you could have spent as a nurse. And if nurses make more money, then the opportunity cost of being an OT has gone up. This is very similar to question 9 on your first homework. This is basically just a different version of that, just with nurses and occupational therapists instead of wheat and soybean farmers. All right, so our supply is going to decrease. It's going to shift to the left. because the opportunity cost of being opportunity cost of being an occupational therapist has gone up. All right, so supply is going to shift to the left. Find the new equilibrium where the new supply curve meets demand. Draw it out. All right, what are we going to see? We're going to see the wage is going to go up and employment is going to go down. So wages up and employment down. All right, that's how we answer part C. Part D, this one's a little tricky. All right, again, let's not even read the question too far before we just start out with the supply and demand graph. You got partial credit if you just drew a graph that started out like this, but surprisingly few people even got this far. Okay, so we know that during our session, incomes tend to fall. We're looking at the market for used cars. Okay, and we're wondering what's going to happen to price of used cars during a recession when incomes are falling. All right, so going back to our list, income is a determinant of demand. Okay, so we know that demand is going to shift. Is demand going to increase or decrease? Well, so we have to specifically remember, if we go back to the slides on supply and demand, remember this demand shifter one, income, that there are two kinds of goods. There are normal goods and there are inferior goods. Normal goods, when your income goes up, your demand for the good goes up. That's most stuff. But there are some goods where when you get poorer, you demand more of them. And when you get richer, you demand less of them. And it seems like used cars might be one of these inferior goods. All right, used cars are an example. I think the textbook gives them as an example of an inferior good, like, they're like ramen noodles or bus tickets. Like when we get really rich, we want to buy a new car. But when we're poorer because of the recession, we might choose to buy a used car instead. All right, so demand is going to increase. And when you graph out the equilibria, you can see that the price of used cars has gone up and the quantity has gone up. So the price is going to go up and the quantity is also going to go up. If you assumed that used cars were a normal good and had demand shift to the left, you got a good amount of partial credit. I think 4 points out of 5. But to get full credit, you had to reason out that used cars are an inferior good. All right, last one here. This one we have two goods. So we've got a large tax on tomatoes. We want to know what that's going to do in the market for salsa and in the market for tortilla chips. So we're going to need two supply and demand graphs here to fully answer this question. So let's start with the market for salsa. And we also got the market for tortilla chips. All right, let's just get our starting point set up. Yeah, before we start worrying about our shock, let's just have our starting point. All right, price, quantity. All right, so we've got a large tax on tomatoes. Tomatoes are more expensive. All right, let's start over in the market for salsa. So if we go back to our list, what does that look like it's going to affect? It's going to affect this, the price of inputs. All right, tomatoes are an input used to make salsa. You can't make salsa without tomatoes. So if tomatoes get more expensive because of the tax, that's going to affect the supply. Here, the supply of salsa. That's price of inputs, determinant of supply. And which way is it going to shift? Well, because tomatoes are more expensive and tomatoes are an input, it's going to shift supply to the left. All right, and it's going to, so salsa, we know the price is going to go up and the quantity sold is going to go down. All right, then over in the market for tortilla chips, going back to our list, looking through here, this one should jump out at you. The price of complements. Tortilla chips and salsa are complement goods. You buy them together. You want salsa to dip your tortilla chips in. Okay, and so if salsa is more expensive, people are going to want to buy less tortilla chips to go with it. Right? You can't buy as much salsa, so you also don't want to buy as many tortilla chips to dip it in. So that's going to shift the demand for tortilla chips to the left. So that's the new supply, that's the new demand. And then when we graph out the equilibria, we see that the price has fallen, gone from there to there, and the quantity's fallen, gone from there to there. All right, so this was probably where people struggled the most, but I hope this helps seeing kind of the steps you can take to solve these problems. All right, so you start with just your supply and demand in equilibria. Then you figure out what's the shock going to be. In this case, the shock is electric cars getting cheaper. You know, here it's more producers joining the market. Here it's a recession. And then you kind of match up with these determinants to figure out which curve is going to move. And then you draw the new curve, compare the equilibriums, and that will tell you what's going to happen to the price and quantity. Right. So these next 5 questions are about elasticity. And elasticity, you're going to want to rely on this slide here, the determinants of elasticity of demand. I think that's going to help with 1, 3, and 5, or A, C, and E. And then this slide, slide 29, is going to help with parts B and D. So let's get to it. The first is asking which is going to be more elastic, the demand curve for cereal or the demand curve for Frosted Flakes cereal. All right, so we're looking at the elasticity of demand. So let's look at our determinants of elasticity of demand. All right, and the one that should jump out at you is this one, the specific versus broad, where specific goods are going to be more elastic than broad goods, because there are more substitutes for specific goods than for broad goods. So here, we would say that the demand, so which is more specific? Frosted Flakes. So demand for Frosted Flakes would be more elastic because it's defined more narrowly. It's defined more narrowly, meaning that there are more available substitutes. All right, for the next one, we've got the supply curve of ivory versus the supply curve of wood. So let's hop over. We are looking at supply now. Okay, and the one that should jump out here is this first one here. And this one actually gives away because it actually lists ivory as an example of a good with a really inelastic supply curve. So the idea here is it's really hard to scale up production of ivory compared to the ease of scaling up production of wood. So supply of wood will be more elastic because it's easier to scale up production in response to increased demand. All right, if we want more wood, we can just plant more trees and chop down more trees. If we want more ivory, there are only so many elephants out there, and there's laws against poaching and stuff like that. All right, C, we're back to looking at a demand curve. So let's go back to our determinants of elasticity of demand. All right, and the one that should jump out for this when we're comparing chemotherapy drugs to hair loss drugs is necessities versus luxuries. All right, so chemotherapy drugs are a necessity. If you don't take them, you'll die of cancer. Whereas hair loss drugs, the worst you'll end up is, worst thing that will happen is you'll end up bald. Okay, so the demand for hair loss drugs will be more elastic because it's is more of a necessity, sorry, more of a luxury compared to chemotherapy drugs. Okay. Part D asks about the demand curve for maple syrup in the short run versus the demand curve for maple syrup in the long run. So again, we can just check out our determinants. That's going to be 2, the time horizon. And if we check out the slide, in the short run, demand is more inelastic. In the long run, demand is more elastic. So we can just say for this one, demand curves are more elastic in the long run. Done. All right, finally, part E. This is it. We're back to supply. So here we need to remember the determinants of elasticity of supply, and geographic scope should jump out at us here. And notice it says that local supply will be more elastic than global supply. And so which of these two is more local? It's Jacksonville. So supply in Jacksonville will be more elastic than supply in the United States, since Jacksonville is more narrowly defined geographically. If there's a big surge in demand for gas in Jacksonville, there are lots of other states and cities that gas can be diverted away from. Whereas if the United States wants more gas, it's a lot harder to divert gas away from other countries. And globally, there's no other planet to divert gas away from. So globally, the supply would be the most inelastic, and locally, it's the most elastic. All right, number 5, this one was lifted pretty much verbatim from the homework. I just changed the task around. But the idea here, and a lot of people got this question wrong in the first problem set, and I was happy to see a lot more people getting it right on the exam. But even though I only wrote half an exam in those 4 hours, it still took me 4 hours. So my opportunity cost in terms of problem sets is the number of problem sets I could have written in 4 hours, or because it takes me 1 hour to write a problem set, 4 problem sets. All right, number 6. This one was pretty tricky, but the answer was all in, if we go to the slides on equilibrium, the answer was exactly here. Okay, we've got a supply shock and a demand shock happening at the same time, and so we need to find out the effects on the equilibrium quantity and price, knowing that one is going to be known and the other is going to be unknown. So let's figure out exactly what's going on. So the first thing that's going on is a key ingredient of sunscreen is getting cheaper. Okay, so that to me and to you should mean that supply is going to decrease. Supply is going to shift to the left. And then at the same time, the warm weather is going to make people want to spend more time outside in the sun. All right, that looking at the determinants of supply and demand, that's kind of tastes or preferences. So this is a demand increase. Sorry, this should say supply increase. I don't know why I said decrease. Increase, it's getting cheaper. The price decreased dramatically, so supply is going to increase. Okay, so we could just look at our table. We've got a supply increase and a demand increase. So if you remembered this table, all you'd have to do is say that the quantity increases and the effect on price is unknown. All right, so if you remember that table, you could do that. The other thing you could do is try to graph this out. So this is the market for sunscreen. Again, we have supply, demand to start. We've got our supply increase and our demand increase. And when we compare the equilibrium, the quantity is unambiguously higher, but we don't know what's up with the price. Here it looks like it didn't change at all, but if we drew it differently, it could have increased, decreased, stayed the same. So if there was a lot of opportunity for partial credit here. You could just talk about the supply increase or just talk about the demand increase, or even if you knew both were happening, but you maybe just guess what the net effect on prices were. But to get full credit, you had to first identify that this is a supply shock and a simultaneous demand shock, and then remember that when you've got both of that, you're going to have an unambiguous positive effect on quantity and an ambiguous effect on price. Okay, and then finally, number 7. Here we need to remember this part of slide 17 looks like. All right, remember we found out that the net benefit was maximized and the net loss was minimized at the equilibrium quantity. All right, so the easiest way to get full credit on this question was to just say something like, would just be say something like, you know, the gain to society, which is producer surplus plus consumer surplus, is maximized at the equilibrium price, and under laissez-faire, or free market, prices and quantities tend towards equilibrium. So really really you only really need the first part to get pretty much full credit, but that's the simplest way to answer the question. There were other things you could say. You could say that you know, buyers will compete with other buyers, and sellers will compete with other sellers. That got you a lot of credit. You could even say that if all exchange is voluntary, then all exchange is mutually beneficial. Basically, the only deals that people will make are deals that both parties think will make them better off. So we should let people make as many deals as they like. As long as you're not forcing someone into exchange, then both parties are entering into that exchange with the expectation that they're both better off. All right, but the easiest way is to just remember the consumer-producer surplus. All right, so that's all the questions. That's how you can answer them, and that's where the answers were in the slides. There wasn't anything like obscure pulled from the textbook. So I hope this helps. I look forward to seeing you guys tomorrow.